After the invasion of Silesia by the Prussian forces, Austria tried desperately to repulse the invaders. They marched north, cutting the Prussian lines of communications. This led to the Battle of Mollwitz. With the Prussian victory, many European powers such as Bavaria, France, Spain and Naples joined Prussia in its attack on the Hasburg Monarchy. With Austria being invaded from all sides, Prussia signed an armistice, but that wouldn't last long as Prussia began moving forces in Moravia and Bohemia, facing the Austrians in the Battle of Chotusitz. In mid-October, Charles Albert of Bavaria and his French allies were encamped near Vienna, ready to besiege it, but he became concerned that Saxony and Prussia would seize parts of Bohemia, which he had also claimed. The French also deprecated a decisive move on Vienna, wishing to see Austria reduced rather than destroyed. So, on 24 October, their forces turned north to march instead on Prague. The Bavarian, French and Saxon armies converged in November, besieging it and ultimately storming it on 26 November. Charles Albert went on to proclaim himself King of Bohemia on 7 December. Meanwhile, in early November, Frederick negotiated the border between putative territories of Prussian Silesia and Saxon Moravia with Frederick Augustus of Saxony, also securing French and Bavarian support for his seizure of the entirety of Silesia, along with the Bohemian county of Glatz. As the Franco-Bavarian allies made territorial gains, Frederick became concerned that Prussia might be sidelined in the eventual peace agreement, so he repudiated the Convention of Klein-Schnellendorf, accusing the Austrians of violating its secrecy, and joined the general advance southward into Bohemia and Moravia. In December, Schwerin's army advanced through the Sudeten into Moravia, occupying the capital at Olmütz on 27 December, while Prince Leopold's army besieged the fortress at Glatz on the edge of Bohemia. In January 1742, the imperial election was held at Frankfurt, where Bavarian elector Charles Albert was chosen as the next Holy Roman Emperor. In early 1742, Frederick organized a joint advance through Moravia toward Vienna with the Saxons and French, which began after their forces met on 5 February at Wischow. The French, however, proved reluctant and uncooperative allies, and after the seizure of Iglau on 15 February, they withdrew into Bohemia. The Prussians and Saxons marched on toward Brunn, the main Austrian stronghold remaining in Moravia, but they made little progress due to the substantial Austrian garrison and a shortage of supplies. The Saxons abandoned the effort on 30 March and returned to Bohemia, where they would remain until withdrawing completely from the war in July. The Moravian campaign achieved no significant gains, and on 5 April the Prussians retreated into Bohemia and Upper Silesia. As the Moravian advance collapsed, Charles Alexander of Lorraine, Maria Theresa's brother-in-law, led a reinforced Austro-Hungarian army of 30,000 through Moravia toward Bohemia, hoping to disperse the Prussians and liberate Prague. Frederick took the offensive and moved into northeast Bohemia. By 16 May, he had 10,000 infantry at Kutna Hora, with 18,000 men under Leopold of Anhalt-Dessau, a day's march behind. Charles was thought to be some distance away, but in the afternoon of 16 May, his cavalry ran into Leopold's rearguard. Recognizing he was in contact with the Austrian main force, Leopold accelerated his march to close the gap with Frederick. At 2 AM on 17 May, his exhausted troops stopped at the small village of Chotusitz, 3 hours' march from Kutna Hora. Instructed to hold until Frederick reached him, Leopold deployed south of Chotusitz, his infantry facing southeast, with cavalry on either flank. The left was commanded by Waldo, the right by the 70-year-old veteran von Buddenbrock, Leopold, leaving room for Frederick's infantry to deploy when they arrived. Charles of Lorraine hoped to attack before Frederick could reach him, but was not ready to do so until 7 AM. As he advanced north from Kaslav, his army drifted slightly to the right, allowing Buddenbrock's cavalry to outflank them. Frederick arrived on the field at 8 AM. To provide time to organize the infantry, he ordered the Prussian cavalry to charge, supported by field artillery. They drove the Austrian cavalry back, but the day was hot and dry, raising a huge cloud of dust and effectively blinding them. In the confusion, some units attacked in the wrong direction, allowing Karl Joseph Bathiany and Liechtenstein to rally their men. Both sets of cavalry began looting each other's baggage trains, an act of collective indiscipline that rendered them useless for much of the battle. The Austrian artillery had been bombarding Chotusitz. Around 9 o'clock am, Daun's infantry stormed the town, slowly driving Leopold's forces from house to house. As they did so, they set it on fire, the smoke adding to the confusion caused by the dust and making exercising command almost impossible. By 10:30, Frederick's fresh infantry were deployed in a great square of 24 battalions. Wheeling left, they fired into the Austrian infantry outside Chotusitz. His flanks exposed by the cavalry's disappearance, Charles decided to settle for a draw. He ordered a general retreat through Kaslav, leaving some of his heavy guns behind. Liechtenstein's cavalry held off the Prussians, and by noon, combat had ceased. The battle left the basic strategic situation unchanged. Charles was still able to move against Prague, while the Prussian presence in Moravia remained a threat to Vienna. Habsburg policy was generally to avoid fighting on too many fronts at the same time, although Prussia was the most dangerous, but also the most difficult to defeat. Although recovering Silesia remained a Habsburg priority for decades, Maria Theresa was willing to agree a temporary truce with Prussia to improve her position elsewhere. In the aftermath of Chotusitz, Prussia intensified its efforts to reach a separate peace with Austria, and negotiators from the two belligerents met again in Breslau in late May. Frederick now demanded almost the whole of Silesia, as well as the county of Glatz. Maria Theresa was reluctant to make such concessions, but the British envoy, Lord Hindford, pressed her to make peace with Prussia and concentrate her forces against the French. The British Treasury had financed much of Austria's war effort through cash subsidies meant to weaken France, and Hindford threatened to withdraw Britain's support. If Maria Theresa refused to concede Silesia, the two belligerents eventually reached an agreement in the 11 June Treaty of Breslau, which ended the First Silesian War. Under this treaty, Austria conceded to Prussia the large majority of Silesia, along with the Bohemian county of Glatz, territories which would later be consolidated to form the Prussian province of Silesia. Austria retained the remainder of Bohemia and two small portions of the extreme southern end of Silesia, including the Duchy of Teschen and parts of the Duchies of Jagendorf, Troppo, and Neisse. These lands would later be combined to form the Crown land of Austrian Silesia. Prussia also agreed to take on some of Austria's debts that had been secured against assets in Silesia, as well as committing to remain neutral for the remainder of the ongoing War of the Austrian Succession. This arrangement was formalized and confirmed in the Treaty of Berlin, signed July 28, 1742. The First Silesian War ended in a clear victory for Prussia, which secured some 35,000 square kilometers of new territory and around 1 million new subjects, greatly enhancing its resources and prestige. However, by twice making a separate peace while the War of the Austrian Succession raged on, Frederick abandoned his erstwhile allies in the League of Nymphenburg and earned a reputation for diplomatic unreliability and double-dealing. With Prussia removed from the wider war, Austria launched a major counterattack and began regaining lost ground on other fronts, and the diplomatic situation shifted in Austria's favor. Prussia's seizure of Silesia also ensured continuing conflict with Austria and Saxony. Maria Theresa's determination to recover Silesia would lead to renewed conflict with Prussia in the Second Silesian War only 2 years later, with the Third Silesian War to follow after another decade. Saxony would take Austria's side in both future conflicts. In the territorial settlement that ended the war, Prussia gained control of extensive new lands in Glatz and Silesia, a populous and densely industrialized region that would contribute substantial manpower and taxes to the Prussian state. The small kingdom's unexpected victory over the Habsburg Monarchy set it apart from German rivals such as Bavaria and Saxony, marking the beginning of Prussia's rise toward the status of a European great power. The The seizure of Silesia made Prussia and Austria into lasting and determined enemies, beginning the Austria-Prussia rivalry that would come to dominate German politics over the next century. Saxony, envious of Prussia's ascendancy and threatened by Prussian Silesia's geostrategic position, also turned its foreign policy firmly against Prussia. Frederick's unilateral withdrawal from the Nymphenburg alliance and its repetition at the end of the Second Silesian War angered the French court, and his next perceived betrayal. A defensive alliance with Britain under the 1756 Convention of Westminster accelerated France's eventual realignment toward Austria in the diplomatic revolution of the 1750s. The Treaties of Breslau and Berlin cost the Habsburg Monarchy its wealthiest province, and capitulating to a lesser German prince significantly dented the Habsburg Monarchy's prestige. The House of Habsburg was also defeated in the imperial election, calling into question its preeminence within Germany. The Austrian army had found itself outmatched by the more disciplined Prussians, and in late 1741 the Nymphenburg alliance had threatened the Habsburg monarchy with disaster. However, peace in the Silesian theatre gave the Austrian forces a free hand to reverse the gains made by the French and Bavarians the previous year. The western invaders were driven back up the Danube Valley in early 1742, and Saxony withdrew its forces from Bohemia after the Treaty of Berlin, making peace with Austria near the end of the year. The Franco-Bavarian forces occupying Prague were isolated and besieged, eventually giving up the city in December. By mid-1743, Austria would recover control of Bohemia, drive the French back across the Rhine into Alsace, and occupy Bavaria, exiling Emperor Charles VII to Frankfurt.